am more than meets the eye. I'm not a measurement to be quantified by data collection. I am scientists, mothers, Mother Nature. I am the answer, the solutions to man-made problems. There are things we do that you cannot see. Our lands are diverse. We are cities, we are towns, we are villages. We are the lands beneath our feet that we sow, we tend to with tradition and innovation. We sow, we reap, we grow, we survive, we continue. There are things that you may not understand, but we are Africa, not the African context. You cannot define us by one thing, for we are a plethora of sustainable development.
Hello, everybody. My name is Sue Parnell. I'm a professor of urban geography here at the University of Bristol, but I'm also an emeritus professor at the University of Cape Town, where I've been very centrally involved in something called the African Centre for Cities. And in both of those capacities, I've had a research interest and a practice interest, actually, in the Sustainable Development Goals. I was one of the people who was engaged in the process that led up to SDG 11, which, if you don't know your numbers, is the urban goal. But I'm more generally concerned with those issues of kind of how do we get from big changes in ideas to really big changes in practice. And that's one of the things that the Cabot Institute has been concerned with. And both Allan and I are interested in cities as a particular place and scale for that implementation. So, Allan.
Hi, yeah, my name's Allan McLeod. I am Bristol's SDG Research and Engagement Associate. SDGs being the UN Sustainable Development Goals that Sue has already mentioned, but my role has been about coordinating activity and engagement with the Sustainable Development Goals at a really local level in the city of Bristol. We've been learning from other examples, other cities around the world, working with academics and with practitioners within the city to try and understand how we can best adopt them for Bristol and how we can try and make sure that the SDGs and the sort of interdisciplinary and multi-dimensional element of the SDGs is something that we can deliver effectively for the complex unit that a city can be. And we've been trying to do that in Bristol for the last 3.5 years. And my role has been trying to coordinate not just the council or the academics around this, but the whole city, working with an alliance and a network that we have in Bristol of businesses, charities, public, private, third sector organisations to try to ensure that the SDGs become something that everyone in Bristol's involved in.
So, Allan, I'm delighted to have this chance to talk, because normally we would bump into each other in the corridor, but it's not normal times, is it? So, and part of why I really did want to touch base with you was Sylvia, Chris and I are busy pulling together a new book on implementing the SDGs in Africa. And part of the reason for that is that, as you know, there's not normally a very articulate or a well-recorded account of what goes on in African cities. But we're getting to the point of trying to kind of think about how different is Africa from other places and the experience of the SDGs. And Bristol keeps popping up as one of the cities that's kind of had a global role in kind of talking about the main challenges of implementation. And so, yeah, I wanted to kind of just do a checklist, I suppose, that we were beginning to at least cover some of those things. I mean, Bristol's been a leader in this space.
Yeah, so I mean, the work on the Sustainable Development Goals in Bristol, it began a while back. It began in 2015, just after the goals were adopted, and it's been growing since then. So it's not something that's just popped up overnight. It's been a networked approach, and it came out of the city's Green Capital year that Bristol was chosen to be a European Green Capital in 2015, and the role and the implementation of the SDGs locally came out of that year. There was a network that formed around the goals, thinking about how the city as a whole could use these goals and how relevant these goals were to Bristol. And I think that's a really key question for any city is, what is the use of this sort of international agenda Why do cities need to talk to an international agenda or try to deliver on one? Can't they focus on the challenges that they face within the city? But I think something that the SDGs provide is that common discourse across the world, and they provide an opportunity for cities to collaborate on their common challenges. It's not necessarily the same policy context or the same exact political or social environment across the world. But what the SDGs do is they provide a framework for discussing and collaborating in different contexts. They provide that common set of challenges that all these different cities face. And that's part of the reason why the SDGs have been found to be useful in Bristol. We get to learn from other cities and we get to support other cities in adopting the goals.
Just on before we get there, you said something about we formed a network. Who led that process? I mean, because one of the things we're really interested in the African context is leadership. So who leads the process and who facilitates the process? What happened in Bristol?
The Bristol process is quite an interesting one because there's a mix of top down and bottom up at the same time. The work that we've been doing has both been coordinated and led by this city network of partners, and that's some of it academia, some of it civil society. That original SDG network, the SDG Alliance, was coordinated by the Bristol Green Capital Partnership, which is that legacy organisation from that Green Capital year. And effectively, we grew from there, working with city partners and working with those who were interested. But at the same time, there was a really interesting increase in political support as well. We had a lot of support from the Mayor of Bristol, and some of that comes down to the diverse nature of Bristol and the opportunity to speak about these common challenges that are being delivered across the world. You know, Bristol's got a really large, diverse population, and actually talking through the language of the SDGs and trying to deliver the SDGs will not only impact in Bristol, but it'll impact Bristol's communities around the world and the networks that Bristol has with communities around the world. So there's 91 different languages spoken in Bristol and lots of different countries represented. And that opportunity to deliver on a global agenda is really powerful for political levels. But there's also a big opportunity to deliver both social and environmental challenges in the same framework. And I think that's the other element for Bristol's politicians, is bringing that together.
That's exactly what I was going to ask about, because so some of what we've seen is that some cities really struggle. They either have a very strong social focus or they have a very strong environmental focus. But the whole point of the SDGs is that you look across the board at those issues of complexity of social, economic, and environmental issues. I mean, has there been a weighting one way or the other in the Bristol case?
I think what it's allowed in the Bristol case is the opportunity to bring both to the table. And I think there's groups in Bristol that really do have a weighting one way or the other. And there's areas of the city that are really focused on some elements of the SDGs. And they come to this framework with their ambitions for those aspects on environmental or on social. And then what you get by bringing the two together under this framework is those groups sat around the same table having these discussions, and those organizations beginning to think about wider than just their own ambitions and wider than just the environmental network. You know, we've got new movements in Bristol around how do we engage with areas of the city that have traditionally faced large inequalities, you know, different ethnic groups or different socioeconomic groups in Bristol. But equally, we've got great movements of areas of the city that have had great prosperity and success that are now engaging with environmental movements who hadn't previously. And I think that's a really powerful aspect of the SDG framework.
And in order to do that, I mean, one of the things which is really marked in quite a lot of the African context is that they've had individuals and groups who know and have quite deep expertise in a particular area or in a particular part of the city. But they've really had to ramp up their data information systems because they just are missing huge chunks of data. So in beginning to sort of think about kind of moving beyond the political importance of the SDG process in changing things locally, but beginning to report in, you know, some of these voluntary national reviews when cities are, or voluntary local reviews, the local version of what the national governments are doing when they report back to the UN on progress on the SDGs. there just hasn't been very much data in place. And there are a couple of cities that have done really well on that. I mean, is a well-resourced city like Bristol had to change anything? Can you just use what's there?
I think there's definitely gaps still, and there's areas that as a city we want to do more, and that's partly down to the way that we want to work in Bristol, because we're trying to deliver the framework and the agenda for the whole city. So it's not just the council, and it's not just the employees of the council that we're trying to deliver it for. It needs a whole city buy-in, and actually data for a whole city and for all the organizations in a city is difficult to get. So there's lots in Bristol that we still want to do. I think one of the challenges with the voluntary local review and that process of cities monitoring the SDGs is that it can just become about the city government and what the city government is trying to do. But actually what we need to work towards is more of an approach to city governance that brings all of the parts and all of the components of a city together. Because I think that's one of the key challenges for any of these issues. They're so interconnected and so multifaceted that actually when you're trying to tackle them, you need more than just what the city government can bring to the table. You need all the levels of power within a city, and that requires so much more. So actually monitoring any changes in that requires even more. I think we've been fortunate in Bristol. I don't want to say that we've had it tough, because we've got some great data systems in Bristol, and we've got some really strong evidence in that regard. But we want more, and I think that's one of the challenges for cities. There's always more that you could have, and I guess one of the sort of key points that I've taken away from our work on the SDGs is it's better to begin and try and start with where you are and understand where you are than to not begin at all. And I think that's one of the key challenges for cities everywhere, is not feeling like they have the capacity to begin because they don't have the stuff in place yet. But actually it's better to have those conversations and to start the work rather than to just get bogged down in trying to find all the right things first.
That's certainly what we're seeing in the African context, and an astonishing number of cities actually have absolutely bought in and are very consciously using the SDG framework, partly interestingly to use it for this kind of harmonization across sectors. But also just as a kind of a normative change, a way to shift the way that government and the populace, the voting kind of cohort, talk about what they want. So that's been really helpful. I wanted to wind back though to something you said in when you were talking in response to my last question. Was you talked a lot about the city. What we see in the African context is that quite a lot of the places, the towns, and some of them are towns, not cities, that are doing well are doing so because they're working with other bits of government better on the SDGs. And my sense of a relatively recent arrival in Bristol is that there's a bit of a disjuncture between what goes on at the city scale and what is happening at the national scale on the SDGs. Am I out of touch? Are there better links than I think there are? And what's, how important is this kind of cross-sector collaboration?
I think there's a range, and it does depend on what topic you're talking about in terms of what the collaboration there is with the national government. And we've got really strong ambitions on issues like climate in Bristol. We've got a lot of activity that we're trying to get through, but a lot of the powers to deliver that are held at the national government. And so we're constantly in conversation with them about trying to change that, about trying to change, the power we have, or trying to influence the power that's held in London, and trying to change the way that is distributed across the country. Throughout the recent COVID pandemic, is something that we've been doing quite a lot of, is raising the challenges that the city has faced with our MPs, so they can bring that to the discussions in Parliament, so that we can then see change in the bills that come through. And it doesn't happen every time, but it's something that we're trying to do better on.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the advantages of having a directly elected representative. Not everywhere has that. So, I mean, it's interesting. So in accessing other bits of national government, so you use MPs, what other kinds of conduits are you able to use?
I mean, we work quite closely with a number of the government departments. We've been really quite well connected to the team that lead on the SDGs within central government. And we've also attended a few cabinet office meetings and supported conversations about how the goals can be used within the UK. We work with the all-party parliamentary group on the SDGs, and we also then talk to various different government departments on SDG adoption. And we've been supporting the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government and talking to them about the SDGs. We've been having conversations with the Planning Inspectorate around how towns and cities can use these goals. So it's something that we try to do, and we recognise that we need the support of those partners and those departments. I think you're right when you say that in that African context, it definitely, the examples of places that are successful are those that do work with the national governments, and that's partly why we're trying to do that better. And many of our best successes are those ones where we do collaborate well with the national government.
And in the regional stuff, because and again, just using the sort of generic Africa, I mean, clearly you can't generalize across the continent, but actually the regional authorities, so the African Union, African Economic Commission, even the African Development Bank, actually have been very influential in setting regional policy frameworks.
I mean, just last week, we supported a regional forum side event about the importance of cities and the need for cities to collaborate and to work on the SDG agenda in this post-COVID recovery time. And that was with partners from the US as well as partners from Europe and with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, Foreign Commonwealth Development Office even. And so that's working with the UK national government. We had the chief planner on that call. We were talking to her about what we've been doing in Bristol from Ministry of Housing and Local Government. And then we also had international partners, and we were supporting the UN Economic Commission for Europe side event in that space. And so I think there's an element that you can jump straight to the national, straight past the national to the international or to the regional, but there's also a need to work with the national government. We've done that in other ways as well around data, working with the Office for National Statistics, but we are also collaborating directly at the international level. Bristol as a city is working quite closely with, work quite closely with Accra and with Durban on the SDG framework through a network called the Brookings Institute SDG City Leadership Network. And we collaborate with them, and we try to learn from each other, but also try to challenge each other to drive further into the SDG agenda. And so there's a real opportunity here for cities to talk directly one-to-one on this, but also to challenge each other and to push further, both at the national level within their own governments, but also at the international level. And that's something that I've seen at a lot of the UN meetings I've been involved in, is this trend of cities calling for their voices to be heard.
Very interesting, isn't it? Because for me, what's fascinating about what you describe is that there's an almost exact parallel in other regions. And it's a similar kind of mix of thought leaders, where university or based academics are really central both to the convening of it and the setting of the agenda of it and of documenting it, but they absolutely are not the only players in the room. They're these incredibly important, and they're a relatively new breed, I think, of people who occupy positions which are not direct delivery in cities or in the multilateral organizations, but are somehow really fundamental for this kind of nudging of this enormous, great big ship. What strikes me though is that it's really hard to get clear lines of sight of kind of what needs to be done and how to make strategic interventions with the appropriate kind of evidence that you require. For cities is COP and being present at COP with a clear message about SDG 11. Because that's the one thing I'm not hearing at the moment, particularly loudly from the African region. Part of that is COVID. It's going to be incredibly difficult to get to COP. But what's Bristol thinking about that?
In terms of the Conference of Parties in Glasgow in November, I think the city as a whole is actually really behind it as an opportunity. And I think that's because we've recognized the need for change, both change in terms of national and in terms of international. And we also recognize that it's not something, if Bristol delivers on the Sustainable Development Goals and on its climate ambitions, it's not going to mean that the world delivers on it. the city needs to work with other places to deliver on all of these issues. And actually, we see this forum and this space as a perfect opportunity for cities to collaborate better and to work better, but also to challenge. And I think that's one of the key things, is there's going to be a lot of challenge around, how do we finance cities so they can make the changes that are needed? And how do we give cities the power that is needed to take action? Because in many places around the world, they don't have that power or that financing to actually do what is needed. Most cities know what needs to happen, and a lot of cities are the ones that are championing the sort of climate emergencies and the rapid decarbonisation. And I know that that's definitely true across Europe and America. I can't speak as much for the African continent, but I know that there's ambitions towards that across the world. And when you look at most of the city work that's happening globally, it is about that smart, low carbon, sustainable cities. And there's often an element of thinking about the SDGs and the inequality within that. But if there isn't, then there's definitely a climate element. And so many cities are thinking about this. It's just most cities don't have the capacity to actually deliver on it, or the finance to deliver on it.
Is there a discussion in Bristol about whether the SDGs need to be amended and reformed in the light of the pandemic, or extended, the timeframes extended at all? I
think we see the work post-COVID as a big opportunity to try and take action on the SDGs. And I think it's given everyone a kick to basically say, we need a change, and things can change quickly. And so it's actually brought a lot of people together around the goals.
I mean, the SDGs the health SDGs are very kind of narrow and, siloed in a way. I mean, the urban health agenda is not well profiled in the SDGs. Is there no concern about that?
I think there is concern, and there's conversations we've had with other cities about this, about what the next steps for the SDGs are. Do we need to reset them? Or do we need to realign the targets for them so that they're actually achievable? But the question of achievability of the SDGs has been one since the start, as far as I can tell. I think a lot of places have said, are these even things we're going to be able to deliver before COVID? So it feels like we still need that ambition. We still need that drive to try and get us there. We still need that opportunity of bringing together all the partners across the world, across nations and across cities to deliver on these goals. So we need to drive towards them. And almost, I think, if we try to reset them, we will lose some of that momentum that is beginning to build.
Interesting, very interesting.
Do you think in from the conversations you're having in with African partners, that's something that they're feeling or they're suggesting?
Look, I think there are huge anxieties in that context about achievability and the ambition. I mean, it's the global problem, right? Until you achieve the SDGs in African cities, you haven't achieved them anywhere. And the gap between even where very limited ambitions have been placed and the reality on the ground is huge, and it will be even bigger in the post-pandemic world. So it absolutely brings home the magnitude of the challenge. I mean, for me, what is striking though is that there certainly is a sense that the overall direction of travel is the correct one, even if the pace of travel is inadequate, and even if the mechanisms for implementation are not yet sufficient. And so those really crucial questions about kind of how do you ensure that money is put in the right places so it can be spent in the right places? How do you ensure that you don't build cities in ways that you then have to retrofit and decarbonize later, that, in other words, that you build right? Forget about build back better. Can we just build in the first place in a way that is correct and will actually be sustainable? So those, I think, are some of the sort of crucial things. And the social question implied in some of those really basic targets of water and sanitation. And so the cross SDG agenda, where you're not just looking at what's going to happen in cities, but you actually look at how all the other SDGs are going to be implemented in these places that are growing so fast and that are going to determine our global future. Not least because if you can't manage the markets of African cities in ways that are sustainable, we know we're going to land up with all sorts of global threats. So I think what's exciting for me about the post-pandemic world is that I think hopefully there's a beginning of a recognition that local challenges need local solutions and local people. But without local solutions, you will never make global progress. And so I think there's a kind of there's a muscle and a power to the African voice, and the SDGs have been quite a powerful vehicle in mobilizing that. So on balance, I mean, it's not without really, really serious problems of implementation. You know, countries which have got no devolved authority to local government, where you've got enormous cities with no data really in place, where you have leadership that it's extremely difficult to communicate across a large city. Not everybody is connected in the same sort of way. And Allan, what really strikes me is that in the African case, a little bit like Bristol, although much more uneven, and often around particular sectors rather around a more sustained holistic SDG agenda. It does seem that what's happening is that there are local initiatives, local interventions that are independent of national government sometimes, certainly that are even more ambitious than national government on occasions, but actually they are indicative of enormous energy and hope. They tend to work best when coordinated with national governments and with regional processes, but on balance, it seems that the logic of the SDGs, the ambition of the SDGs, the idea of a global agenda has galvanized a direction of travel that has been helpful in thinking about where we want cities to be in order to create a more sustainable world.
And what would you, if you could have any success over the next 5 years in your work, and what's the key thing you would want to see delivered in the next 5 years with your work?
Look, it depends at what level you're talking about. In terms of the global SDG stuff, for me, what's really fundamental is to realize that until we actually deal with the imperatives of African cities as some of the poorest in the world, and some of the least well-resourced, that we will not achieve any global ambitions. So we absolutely need examples, we need progress, we need action. You can't not act, you know, in Copenhagen because you have yet to achieve what you need to do in Douala. But until we've got everything right in Douala, there isn't much hope for anybody sitting in Copenhagen. And I think it's that ability to think locally, act locally, but to understand global drivers and global consequences that happen in and through cities. That would be, for me, the ambition. If urbanists can grab that and speak to that question and engage with policymakers to prioritize and to deal with that kind of complexity, because it's a very complex demand, then we will have made significant progress. So, yeah. You?
I think it's about that complexity and recognizing the need for multiple partners in delivering on the complexity. And the more that cities begin to work within themselves better, but also with each other, I think is the more we will see change at a quicker scale as well. I think it's as we see businesses and charities and cities and academia coming together to solve these common challenges and then roll them out across the world, I think that is where we will hopefully see rapid change. But it's going to take a fair amount of humility, I think, from organizations and from those in power across the world to recognize that actually we do need that local voice and we do need those local actors, like you've been saying, like I've been saying. Good
to talk. We need to have corridor. Hopefully we can get back into the corridor and have some of these conversations and begin to reflect on the different challenges from different parts of the world. That would be a really nice thing to do.
Exactly, over a coffee and a cup of tea or a biscuit
and
or
what needs to be prioritized in different places, because I think that's one of the roles of scholars is not just to push the idea that things are complex, but then also to help order thought and evidence to distill, so we are able to actually make the right decisions at the right time, and that we deal with some of the problems where there's incommensurate evidence. That's a really important thing to do. So yeah. If you had to say what would be your central message to policymakers based on the work you've been doing, how would you distill that?
I think the key message is you need to listen to cities, you need to listen to the challenges that cities face, and you need to support cities. They're key innovators in delivering on all of these agendas, and cities are a great place to test opportunities for innovation. They're much closer to the problems, and they're closer to solutions often, and they're better at trialing and innovating those solutions. So it's about respecting the challenges that cities face and recognizing that they have a key role in the delivery of them, and that actually cities working together with partners, with national governments, with other international cities are going to be key in our delivery of any of these agendas and any of the ambitions that we hold for the future of the world. But what about you, Sue? What would you say is your key message to policymakers?
Well, I've got a relatively short-term key message for policymakers. It's not immediate, it's a short, medium-term thing, which is that I think the case has now been made and everybody accepts it, that cities are absolutely fundamental to any large-scale transformation, whether you're talking about climate change or whether you're talking about biodiversity or whether you're talking about social equity. The problem is that those ideas are driven nationally and globally, and there are no platforms, no institutional mechanisms for ensuring that you hear the voice of cities. And so making sure that you find, whether it's a conference of mayors, whether it's an urban science structure and organization, there is no mechanism for consolidating and amalgamating or disseminating the urban agenda as it relates to any of the big global challenges. And so for me, trying to establish something which works in that way, which can provide evidence and which can distribute evidence to the right scale is fundamental, because the local scale absolutely can't be ignored. And at the moment, there's a disconnect in the way that we deal with that in the kind of broad area of urban policy and urban science. So yeah, it's not an overnight task, but I think it's something that could be achieved relatively easily.